The unmarked sedan rolled to a stop outside a pristine colonial home in Fairfield, Connecticut, its engine ticking in the pre-dawn silence of March 2024. Detective Maria Santos sat behind the wheel, her breath fogging the windshield as she stared at the house with its perfect lawn, its basketball hoop over the garage, its American flag hanging from the front porch. 26 years. 26 years this person had lived here, coached Little League games, attended parent-teacher conferences, smiled at neighbors over backyard fences while Timothy Caldwell stayed 19 forever in a grave at Willowbrook Cemetery. Santos took a breath that burned in her chest, checked her weapon out of habit though she didn't expect to need it, and stepped out into the cold March morning. The arrest warrant in her jacket pocket represented thousands of hours of work, millions of DNA base pairs analyzed, and one family's quarter-century wait for a truth that would shatter this quiet suburban street into 1,000 pieces. Before we continue the story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Cases like this take years of research and investigation to bring you, and your support helps us tell the stories that deserve to be told. The call had come in on a Saturday morning in October of 1998, the kind of crystalline autumn day when Connecticut feels like a postcard of itself, all brilliant foliage and clean cold air that smells like wood smoke and dying leaves. A jogger had been running the trails off Route 7 in Wilton, one of those wooded areas that still existed between the steady creep of suburban development, where you could pretend for a moment you weren't 20 miles from the chaos of I-95. She'd been following her usual path, earbuds in, enjoying the crunch of leaves under her shoes, when something caught her eye in the underbrush about 15 feet off the trail. At first she thought it was a mannequin, one of those pranks teenagers sometimes pull around Halloween because the stillness was too complete, too wrong for something living. But when she got closer, close enough to see the details her brain didn't want to process, she understood with a sick clarity that this was no prank. This was a person. This was someone who had been alive and now wasn't, lying in the leaves like discarded trash while the morning sun filtered through the trees and birds sang, because nature doesn't stop for human tragedy. The Wilton Police Department responded within minutes of her 911 call, patrol officers securing the scene with shaking hands because Wilton wasn't the kind of place where you found bodies in the woods. This was the town of good schools and historic homes and families who'd lived here for generations alongside newer arrivals from the city, looking for safety and space. The violent crime rate was essentially non-zero. People left their doors unlocked. Kids walked home from school alone. Finding a body was the kind of thing that happened in Bridgeport or Hartford, not here, not in a place where the biggest news was usually about zoning disputes and high school football games. But here it was anyway. Death arriving in their pristine town like an unwelcome guest who wouldn't leave. The Connecticut State Police Major Crime Squad arrived by mid-morning, Detective John Breslin catching the case because the Wilton PD didn't have a homicide unit, didn't need one normally. Breslin was 43 then, a veteran of the state police who'd worked everything from drug trafficking to gang violence in the rougher parts of the state. He approached the scene with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that small details often broke cases. The crime scenes talked if you knew how to listen. The victim was a young male, late teens or early 20s, dressed in jeans and a Yukon sweatshirt, lying face down in a position that suggested he'd been dumped rather than killed where he lay. There were signs of violence, evidence of a struggle, but Breslin kept those details clinical and contained because the family didn't need to know everything. Some images couldn't be unseen. What mattered was that someone's son was dead in these woods, and Breslin's job was to figure out who and why and make sure whoever did this answered for it. The identification came quickly through fingerprints in the wallet still in the victim's pocket, because this hadn't been a robbery, hadn't been about money or theft or anything that made conventional sense. His name was Timothy James Caldwell, 19 years old, resident of Wilton, currently enrolled as a sophomore at the University of Connecticut, studying computer science. His driver's license photo showed a kid with glasses and dark hair and a slight smile, the kind of awkward teenager photo that everyone has, the kind you're supposed to look back on years later and laugh about how young you looked. Except Timothy wouldn't be looking back on anything. He'd been reported missing by his parents 2 days earlier when he failed to come home from a friend's house, and now here he was, and Breslin had to make the call that would destroy a family's world. Richard and Susan Caldwell lived in a modest Cape Cod on Olmsted Hill Road, the kind of house that spoke of comfortable middle-class stability without ostentation. Richard was a civil engineer for the state. Susan taught fourth grade at Miller Driscoll School. They'd raised their two children in this house, filled it with the ordinary chaos of homework and dinner table conversations and the small rituals that make a family. When Breslin rang their doorbell that Saturday afternoon with a state police chaplain beside him, Susan answered the door already knowing something terrible had happened, because mothers know. They always know. Breslin watched her face cycle through denial and hope, and then collapse into a grief so raw it made him look away, made him remember why he sometimes hated this job, why delivering death notifications never got easier no matter how many times you did it. Timothy had been everything you'd want in a kid growing up in the 1990s. He'd been quiet but not withdrawn, smart in a way that made teachers light up when they talked about him, passionate about computers and the internet in an era when the digital world was still new and exciting and full of possibility. This was 1998, the tail end of the dot-com boom, when everyone with technical skills was being promised a golden future in Silicon Valley. Timothy had been teaching himself web design, building sites for local businesses for pocket money, dreaming about the companies he'd start, the code he'd write, the future he'd build in a world that was just beginning to understand how technology would reshape everything. He had a dog-eared copy of HTML for Dummies on his nightstand, bookmarked pages about JavaScript and CGI scripts, dreams recorded in notebooks full of website sketches and business ideas that would never be realized. His friends described him as loyal and kind, maybe a little nerdy, but in the endearing way of someone who got excited about things and wanted to share that excitement with you. He'd spent high school in the computer lab, part of a small group of kids who understood that these machines were going to matter, who could see the future arriving through dial-up modems and primitive search engines. He'd had a girlfriend briefly junior year, a sweet, awkward relationship that ended amicably when she went to college in Vermont. He worked part-time at the Blockbuster Video on Route 7, one of those after-school jobs the teenagers took for spending money, standing behind the counter in the blue and yellow polo shirt, recommending movies to customers, rewinding tapes, making small talk with regulars who came in every Friday to rent their weekend entertainment. He'd been home from Yukon for fall break, back in Wilton for a week to do laundry and eat his mother's cooking and catch up with high school friends who'd scattered to various colleges. On the night of October 23rd, a Friday, he'd driven to his friend Dave Morrison's house in neighboring Ridgefield for a casual hangout, nothing unusual, just playing video games and watching whatever movie Dave had borrowed from work. Several friends were there, and they all later told police the same thing. Timothy had been normal, happy even, talking about a computer science project he was excited about, laughing at inside jokes, eating pizza and drinking Mountain Dew and being 19 in all the unremarkable ways that teenagers are. He'd left around 10 p.m., said goodbye to everyone, mentioned he needed to get home because his mom wanted the family to go to breakfast the next morning. He'd walked out to his car, a beat-up 1991 Honda Civic that was more rust than paint, but ran reliably, and driven off into a night he would never come home from. The timeline after that became the focus of Breslin's initial investigation, because somewhere in the 2 hours between Timothy leaving Dave's house and when he should have arrived home, something had gone catastrophically wrong. The drive should have taken 15 minutes, maybe 20 if you caught the one traffic light on Route 7. Timothy's parents had expected him by 10:30, hadn't worried when 11 came and went because Timothy was 19 and college kids lose track of time. But when midnight passed and then 1 a.m. and their calls to a cell phone, one of those brick-sized models that mostly stayed in his car, went to voicemail, Susan had felt the first tendrils of real fear. By morning, when he still wasn't home, when his bed was still made and his car wasn't in the driveway, they'd called the police. Timothy's Honda was found on Sunday afternoon in the parking lot of the Stop and Shop on Danbury Road, abandoned in a corner spot away from the store entrance. There was no sign of struggle inside the vehicle, no blood, nothing missing that his parents could identify. His backpack was still in the passenger seat with his Yukon student ID and a textbook on C++ programming. His cell phone was in the center console, battery dead. The keys were gone, presumably taken by whoever had left the car there, though they'd never been found. Police canvassed the shopping center, interviewed employees and customers who'd been there over the weekend. But the parking lot had no security cameras in 1998. That technology wasn't ubiquitous yet, and nobody remembered seeing anything unusual about a beat-up Honda sitting in a parking lot. Breslin worked the case with the intensity it demanded, knowing that the first 48 hours were critical, and they'd already lost that window while Timothy had been classified as a missing person rather than a homicide victim. He assembled a team of state police investigators and Wilton officers, divided up assignments, began the methodical process of interviewing everyone in Timothy's orbit. His parents were quickly cleared, their grief too raw and genuine to be performance. His younger sister Emily, 16 and devastated, had been home all night and had nothing useful to offer except tears and the kind of survivor's guilt that comes when your sibling doesn't come home, and you did. His Yukon friends were back at school with alibis and no apparent motive. His Wilton friends were interviewed extensively, particularly Dave Morrison and the others who'd been at the house that night. But everything checked out. Everyone's story matched. Nobody saw anything suspicious. The investigation expanded to the blockbuster where Timothy worked, because workplace connections sometimes revealed conflicts or jealousies that friends and family missed. The store manager, a tired woman named Patricia Chen who'd been running the location for 6 years, was shocked and grieving in the way that managers grieve for young employees who weren't supposed to die. She described Timothy as reliable and well-liked, never had problems with customers, got along with all his coworkers, showed up for his shifts on time, and did his job without complaint. Breslin interviewed every employee who'd worked with Timothy, got the same story from all of them. Nice kid, smart, kept to himself mostly but friendly enough. Nobody had issues with him. Nobody could imagine why anyone would hurt him. One of those co-workers was a 22-year-old named Michael Hendricks, who'd been working at Blockbuster for 3 years while taking classes part-time at Norwalk Community College. Breslin interviewed him in the store's back office, a cramped space that smelled like stale popcorn and old carpet. Hendricks had seemed shaken by Timothy's death, said they'd worked together often, had gotten along fine, didn't know each other outside of work but were friendly during shifts. He'd last seen Timothy 2 days before he disappeared, had been on the closing shift with him that Wednesday. They talked about movies and computers. Timothy had mentioned being excited about fall break, and then they'd locked up and gone their separate ways. Hendricks had an alibi for Friday night, had been at his girlfriend's apartment in Stamford with multiple witnesses, seemed genuinely upset about Timothy's death. Breslin made notes, filed the interview away, moved on because nothing about Michael Hendricks raised any flags. Nothing suggested he was anything other than a shocked co-worker mourning a colleague. The forensic evidence collected from Timothy's body and the crime scene was processed through the Connecticut State Police Lab with urgent priority. There was DNA evidence, biological material that didn't belong to Timothy, found in a location that suggested direct contact with the perpetrator. This was 1998, and DNA technology was advancing rapidly but still limited compared to what would come later. The profile was solid enough to be useful if they had a suspect to compare it against, but without that suspect it was just data, just a genetic signature waiting for a match. Breslin ran it through Connecticut's DNA database, then through CODIS, the national system that had only been fully operational for a year. No hits. Whoever had killed Timothy Caldwell either had no criminal record or had committed their crimes before DNA collection became standard practice. The investigation hit wall after wall through the fall and winter of 1998. Every lead that seemed promising dissolved into nothing. Every witness who might have seen something useful turned out to have seen something irrelevant. A few tips came in through the police hotline, people who'd seen suspicious vehicles or remembered arguments or wanted to point fingers at neighbors they didn't like, but none of it panned out. Breslin worked the case for months, reviewing evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, searching for the connection he'd missed, the detail that would crack everything open. But as 1999 arrived and Timothy had been dead for 3 months, Breslin felt the terrible weight of a case going cold, felt the momentum dying despite his best efforts. New cases demanded attention. Resources had to be allocated elsewhere. The Caldwell family called weekly for updates he didn't have, and every conversation left him feeling like he'd failed them, like he'd failed Timothy, like justice was slipping through his fingers no matter how tightly he tried to hold on. On the first anniversary of Timothy's death, October 23, 1999, the Caldwell family held a vigil at Wilton Town Green. 100 people showed up, friends and family and community members who wanted to show support, who needed to believe that Wilton was still safe and this was just an anomaly, an outlier, a terrible thing that wouldn't happen again. Susan Caldwell spoke about her son, her voice breaking as she described the future he'd never have, the grandchildren she'd never meet, the technological innovations he might have created in a world that was racing forward into the digital age without him. Richard stood beside her with his arm around Emily, who was 17 now and had stopped smiling the way she used to, who carried her brother's absence like a physical weight. Breslin attended the vigil in plain clothes, standing at the back of the crowd, feeling like an intruder at a ceremony that marked his failure. He caught Susan's eye across the green, saw the question there that she didn't have to speak out loud. "Have you found who killed my son?" And he had to look away because the answer was written on his face, and the answer was no, and he didn't know if that answer would ever change. The years after Timothy's death moved with that strange dual quality that grief imposes on time, simultaneously crawling and racing. Days that felt endless while entire years disappeared in a blink. For Richard and Susan Caldwell, 1999 bled into 2000 and then beyond, each passing month creating more distance from the last time they'd seen their son alive, but never, not for a single day, diminishing the absence he'd left behind. Their house on Olmsted Hill Road became a museum of sorts, Timothy's bedroom left exactly as he'd had it, computer monitor dark but still on the desk, posters of The Matrix and Fight Club still on the walls, HTML for Dummies still on the nightstand with his reading glasses folded on top. Susan couldn't bring herself to pack any of it away, couldn't bear the finality of boxing up a life that had ended too soon. Richard understood, though sometimes he'd stand in the doorway of that room and feel the weight of it crushing his chest. This shrine to a future that never arrived. This evidence that their son had existed and now didn't, and nobody had been held accountable. Emily Caldwell was 16 when her brother died, caught in that terrible space between childhood and adulthood, old enough to understand the full horror of murder, but young enough to still need the innocence that knowledge destroyed. She'd been close to Timothy despite their 3-year age gap, had looked up to him the way younger siblings do, had gone to him with homework questions and boy problems and dreams about her own future. He'd taught her basic HTML one summer. The two of them hunched over his computer while he showed her how to build a simple web page, how to make text change colors and images appear, magic tricks of code that felt like opening a door to another world. After his death, Emily couldn't look at computers the same way. She'd been planning to follow Timothy into technology, had been thinking about majoring in computer science herself, but now those machines felt cursed, associated forever with her brother's passion and his absence. She switched her focus to English instead, threw herself into reading and writing, anything that let her escape into other people's stories because her own story was too painful to inhabit. The rest of Emily's high school years passed in a fog of complicated grief. She graduated in 2000, her parents sitting in the audience at commencement, crying for 2 reasons, proud of their daughter but devastated that Timothy wasn't there to see it, that he'd never have his own graduation, his own future unfolding. Emily went to Wesleyan University, staying close to home because she couldn't bring herself to go far when her parents seemed so fragile, so liable to break completely if she wasn't nearby. She majored in literature, dated a few guys who never quite worked out, made friends who knew about her brother and tried to be sensitive but couldn't really understand. How do you explain to someone what it's like to have your sibling murdered? How do you articulate the specific pain of unsolved cases, where there's no closure, no trial, no moment of justice that might provide even the smallest sense of resolution? Emily learned to carry it quietly, learned to smile when people asked if she had siblings, learned to say, "I had a brother, he passed away," in a tone that discouraged follow-up questions. Detective John Breslin retired from the Connecticut State Police in 2010 after 30 years of service. His farewell party attended by dozens of colleagues who respected him and cases he'd closed with dogged determination. But when he cleaned out his desk that last day, there was one case file he couldn't leave behind. He'd made unofficial copies over the years, boxed up photographs and witness statements and forensic reports that technically should have stayed in official storage. His wife Patricia had given him a look when he brought those boxes home, had said nothing but her expression conveyed everything. "You're supposed to be retiring, John. You're supposed to be letting go." But Breslin couldn't let go of Timothy Caldwell, couldn't accept that a 19-year-old kid with his whole life ahead of him had been murdered, and the killer had simply vanished into the fabric of Connecticut, living their life while Timothy's parents aged and grieved. In retirement, Breslin set up what Patricia half-jokingly called his obsession corner in their garage, a folding table covered with Timothy's case materials, a corkboard with photographs and timeline reconstructions connected by red string like something from a detective movie. He'd spent hours out there reading through witness statements he practically memorized, looking for connections he might have missed when the case was fresh. He attended forensic science conferences on his own dime, sitting in hotel ballrooms learning about advances in DNA technology, about new methods for extracting genetic material from degraded samples, about something called genetic genealogy that had started making waves after a case in California. In 2018, when news broke that they'd caught the Golden State Killer using family DNA databases, Breslin felt something shift in his chest. Hope, maybe, or just renewed obsession. But whatever it was had him calling Detective Maria Santos the next day. Santos had inherited the Caldwell case when she transferred to the State Police Major Crime Squad in 2015, one of dozens of cold cases that sat in file cabinets waiting for breakthroughs that might never come. She was 31 then, young for a detective, but sharp and hungry to prove herself, and she'd spent months absorbing every detail of Timothy's murder. When Breslin reached out about genetic genealogy in 2018, she listened carefully because you don't dismiss a veteran detective who'd worked the original investigation, who'd spent 12 years living with this case. They met for coffee at a diner off I-95. Breslin bringing his boxes of unofficial files, Santos bringing questions about how this new technology actually worked and whether it could be applied to a case from 1998. The problem was resources. Genetic genealogy wasn't cheap, required sending evidence to specialized labs and hiring genetic genealogists and dedicating significant time to building family trees that might span generations. The state police budget was tight. Cold cases competed with active investigations for funding, and there were no guarantees this would work. Santos made a mental note of it, though, filed the idea away for when circumstances might align, when she could make a pitch that brass would approve. That opportunity wouldn't come until 2023, 25 years after Timothy's death, when advances in DNA technology made genetic genealogy more reliable and cost-effective, when several high-profile cold cases had been solved using the technique, and it had become more accepted in law enforcement's circles. Meanwhile, the Caldwell family marked time through the milestones Timothy would never reach. Emily graduated from Wesleyan in 2004, got her master's degree in education from Yale in 2006, started teaching high school English in New Haven. She met a man named David Chen at a friend's wedding in 2008, a quiet architect who made her laugh and didn't press when she needed space, who understood that some wounds never fully heal. They married in 2010, a beautiful ceremony that her parents attended with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes because weddings are supposed to include your whole family, and half of theirs was missing. Emily had 2 children, a daughter in 2012 and a son in 2015, and watching her become a mother broke Susan's heart in new ways because Timothy would have been an uncle, would have spoiled these grandchildren the way uncles do, and instead they'd grow up never knowing him except through stories and photographs. Richard Caldwell's health began declining in 2016, stress and grief taking their cumulative toll in the form of high blood pressure and heart problems that required medication and lifestyle changes. He'd always been active, running marathons in his 40s, but now he felt old in a way that had nothing to do with his actual age. He was 68, should have had good years ahead of him, but carrying an unsolved murder in your heart for 18 years does something to a body that doctors can't quite measure. Susan watched him fade incrementally, saw him staring at nothing sometimes, knew he was thinking about Timothy, about justice they'd never received, about dying without answers. She'd become a victims' rights advocate over the years, speaking at events about cold cases and the families left behind, channeling her grief into activism because sitting still with it felt impossible. The community of Wilton had largely moved on, the way communities always do. The Blockbuster where Timothy worked closed in 2007, victim of the same digital revolution he'd been so excited about, Netflix and streaming killing video rental stores across America. The building sat empty for a while before being torn down for a CVS pharmacy, another piece of 1998 disappearing into progress. Some of Timothy's friends still lived in the area, now approaching 40 themselves, married with kids and mortgages and careers, occasionally thinking about their murdered friend when October came around, but not dwelling on it the way his family did. Because they couldn't, because you can't carry so. Else's grief forever without drowning in it. Detective Santos never forgot, though. She kept Timothy's picture on her desk, a photo from his high school graduation showing a skinny kid with glasses and an awkward smile, and his whole future supposedly ahead of him. She pulled the case file periodically, reviewed the evidence, called the Caldwells every 6 months with updates even when there were no updates, because they deserved to know someone still cared, someone still remembered. In late 2023, she attended a conference on genetic genealogy in Boston, sat through presentations about successful cold case resolutions, talked with representatives from Othram Labs about their process and success rates. Flying back to Connecticut, Santos made a decision. It was time to try something new with the Caldwell case. Time to see if 25 years of technological advancement could finally reveal what 1998 science couldn't. She wrote the proposal carefully, included statistics on genetic genealogy success rates, detailed the emotional and community impact of leaving the case unsolved, made the argument that solving a high-profile cold case would demonstrate the state police's commitment to justice regardless of time elapsed. In December 2023, she presented to the Major Crime Squad commander, brought photos of Timothy at 19 and the Caldwell family at his grave, made it personal because cold cases are personal even when you're trying to be professional. The commander approved the budget in January 2024. Santos called Breslin first, told the now 73-year-old retired detective that they were finally going to try genetic genealogy. He cried on the phone, which made Santos's eyes burn because tough old detectives don't cry unless something matters desperately. Then she called Susan Caldwell, told her they were sending Timothy's evidence to a specialized lab for genetic genealogy analysis. Susan was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was careful, guarded by years of disappointment. "Will this work?" she asked. Santos couldn't promise anything, could only say they were going to try, that technology had advanced, that there was real hope. But she heard the fear underneath Susan's question, the terror of hoping again after so many years of nothing, of letting yourself believe in justice and being crushed when it doesn't arrive. Susan said she'd tell Richard, asked Santos to keep them updated, hung up with a goodbye that sounded like a prayer. The evidence from Timothy Caldwell's 1998 murder had been stored in a climate-controlled facility at the Connecticut State Police Forensic Lab for 26 years, preserved in sealed containers with chain of custody documentation that tracked every time someone had accessed it. In February 2024, Detective Maria Santos personally transported those samples to Othram Labs in Texas, a company that specialized in forensic-grade genome sequencing and had successfully worked dozens of cold cases across the country. The DNA sample from Timothy's case was degraded, not surprising given its age and the conditions under which it had been collected. But Othram scientists were confident they could enhance it using proprietary extraction and amplification techniques that hadn't existed in 1998. Santos flew back to Connecticut and waited, checking her email obsessively for updates, trying not to let hope get ahead of reality because she'd worked enough cases to know that breakthroughs were never guaranteed, no matter how promising the technology seemed. The science behind genetic genealogy was elegant in its logic but painstaking in its execution. Othram would extract whatever usable DNA remained from the evidence, amplify it using advanced sequencing technology, then create a comprehensive genetic profile that could be uploaded to public genealogy databases like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. These databases contained millions of profiles from people who'd submitted their DNA, hoping to learn about their ancestry, trace their family trees, maybe connect with distant relatives they'd never known existed. What those users probably hadn't anticipated was that their genetic information could also be used to identify criminals through familial connections, that a distant cousin's curiosity about their Irish heritage might someday help catch a killer. The technique had revolutionized cold case work after the Golden State Killer arrest in 2018, but it required patience and expertise and a genetic genealogist who could build family trees spanning centuries. Santos received the call from Othram in late February. They'd successfully created an enhanced DNA profile suitable for genealogical analysis. The profile was uploaded to GEDmatch within days, and the system immediately identified several distant relatives who shared DNA segments with the unknown perpetrator. These weren't close matches, not siblings or first cousins, but third and fourth and fifth cousins, people separated by 4 or 5 generations who shared common ancestors born in the 1800s. To build a case from these distant connections required extraordinary genealogical work, tracing family lines backward through time to find the common ancestors, then forward through all their descendants to identify which ones fit the geographic and age parameters of Timothy's killer. Santos hired Barbara Chen, a genetic genealogist who'd successfully worked 15 cold cases and had a reputation for meticulous research and creative problem-solving when records were incomplete or contradictory. Chen was a former librarian who discovered her talent for genealogy while researching her own family history, getting lost in census records and immigration documents and church registries, learning to piece together lives from fragmentary evidence. She transitioned into forensic work after attending a presentation about the Golden State Killer case, recognizing that her skills could serve justice in ways she'd never imagined. She approached the Caldwell case with the intensity it deserved, knowing that somewhere in the branches of these family trees was a name that would finally give Timothy's family answers. The work consumed months. Chen built elaborate family trees going back to the Civil War era, identifying common ancestors shared by the DNA matches, then methodically documenting every descendant through births, marriages, deaths, and migrations. She worked with historical societies and genealogical databases, pored over census records from multiple states, tracked surname changes and geographic movements, assembled a massive puzzle where each piece was a human life. By May 2024, she'd identified several family lines that all connected back to Connecticut and neighboring New York in the 1800s. Clusters of relatives who'd stayed in the region for generations. The challenge now was narrowing down which modern descendants would have been the right age and location to have killed Timothy in 1998. The initial list included over 90 male descendants who would have been between 18 and 50 in October 1998. Chen and Santos worked together to eliminate candidates, crossing off men who died before 1998, who were living in other states with documentation proving they couldn't have been in Connecticut, who were incarcerated during the relevant time frame, who had alibis from other cases or circumstances. By June, they'd narrowed the list to 27 viable candidates who needed deeper investigation. Santos began the delicate process of background checks without alerting the subjects, pulling DMV records and employment histories and property records, anything public that would reveal where these men had been living in 1998. One name kept drawing her attention with increasing intensity: Michael Joseph Hendricks, born in 1976, which made him 22 in October 1998. He'd lived in Connecticut his entire life, currently residing in Fairfield in a house he'd owned since 2008. Santos pulled his employment records and felt her pulse quicken. In 1998, Michael Hendricks had worked at the Blockbuster Video on Route 7 in Wilton, the same Blockbuster where Timothy Caldwell had worked. Santos went back to the original case file with shaking hands, found the witness interview that Detective Breslin had conducted with Hendricks in November 1998. He'd been questioned as a co-worker, had seemed upset about Timothy's death, had an alibi for the night in question that had checked out at the time. But now, 26 years later, with genetic genealogy pointing directly at him, Santos looked at that old interview with new eyes and saw what they'd missed. The alibi had been his girlfriend at the time, now long since broken up with location unknown, difficult to re-verify after so many years. The connection to Timothy had been documented but not deeply investigated because Hendricks had seemed like just another shocked co-worker with no apparent motive. Santos spent weeks building a comprehensive background on Michael Hendricks before making any moves. On paper, he looked like a model citizen, the kind of person you'd never suspect of violence. He was 48 now, married to Jennifer Morgan Hendricks for 24 years, father to two daughters aged 22 and 19. He left Blockbuster in 2001, worked in retail management for several years, then transitioned into financial services, eventually becoming a certified financial advisor with a small but successful practice. He had no criminal record beyond a speeding ticket in 2015, paid his taxes on time, owned his home outright, attended Fairfield Community Church where he'd been a member since 2005. He coached youth soccer for 8 years when his daughters were growing up, served on the Fairfield Board of Education from 2018 to 2022, volunteered with Habitat for Humanity. His social media presence showed a man who loved his family, posted pictures of vacations and graduations and grandchildren because his older daughter had made him a grandfather in 2023, a little boy named Connor, who appeared regularly in photos showing a doting grandfather who seemed genuinely devoted. The disconnect between this respectable life and what the DNA evidence suggested was profound and disturbing, but Santos had learned long ago that monsters don't advertise themselves. She thought about BTK, the serial killer who'd been a church president and Cub Scout leader. She thought about the Golden State Killer, a former cop and grandfather. She thought about all the cases where neighbors said he seemed so normal after someone was arrested for horrific crimes. Evil doesn't announce itself with obvious signs. It camouflages itself behind smiles and community service and the appearance of normalcy, and Michael Hendricks had been hiding behind that camouflage for 26 years. But genetic genealogy alone wasn't enough for an arrest warrant. Santos needed direct DNA evidence from Hendricks himself, a sample that could be definitively compared to the crime scene profile, and she needed to obtain it legally, in a way that would hold up in court when defense attorneys inevitably challenged the chain of custody and the methods used. The standard approach was collecting abandoned DNA, items discarded in public that were legally considered trash and therefore accessible without a warrant. A coffee cup, a water bottle, a napkin, anything with saliva or skin cells that could yield a genetic profile. They required surveillance, patience, and timing, but it was the cleanest way to get what they needed. Santos assembled a small surveillance team in early July, briefing them carefully on the target and the importance of remaining undetected. Michael Hendricks' daily routine was depressingly normal. He left his house around 7:30 each morning, stopped at the same Starbucks on the Post Road for coffee, arrived at his office in a small professional building by 8:15. He met with clients through the day, went to lunch at various restaurants, usually left work around 5, went home to his wife and occasionally met friends for dinner or attended church events. He lived the life of a successful middle-aged professional with absolutely no indication that he was aware of being investigated, no signs of guilt or paranoia or concern. Santos wondered sometimes if he even remembered killing Timothy Caldwell, if 26 years had allowed him to bury it so deeply that he'd convinced himself it never happened, or if he thought about it every day and had just gotten extraordinarily good at pretending. The surveillance lasted 3 weeks before they got their opportunity. On July 23rd, Hendricks stopped at a Dunkin' Donuts in Fairfield, ordered a large iced coffee and a breakfast sandwich, sat in his BMW in the parking lot eating while checking his phone. When he finished, he tossed the cup and the sandwich wrapper in the trash can outside the entrance and drove away toward his office. The surveillance team waited 15 minutes to be absolutely certain he wasn't coming back, then retrieved the cup, carefully bagging it as evidence and documenting the time, location, and chain of custody with the precision that would be required in court. The cup was rushed to the Connecticut State Police lab with urgent priority, Santos riding along because she couldn't stand to let it out of her sight, not after coming this far, not when they were so close to finally answering the question that had haunted a family for 26 years. The lab worked fast, extracting DNA from saliva residue on the cup's rim, processing it through their systems, comparing it to the profile from Timothy Caldwell's 1998 crime scene. Santos waited in the lab's observation area, unable to sit still, pacing like an expectant father in an old movie, while technicians ran tests that would either confirm what genetic genealogy suggested or send them back to square one. When the forensic scientist finally emerged and told her the results, Santos had to ask him to repeat it because her brain couldn't quite process what her ears were hearing. The DNA from Michael Hendricks' coffee cup matched the DNA from Timothy Caldwell's crime scene. Not a familial match suggesting a relative, not a partial match requiring additional verification, but a complete match, 13 CODIS core loci, all matching. The statistical probability of this being anyone other than Michael Hendricks was approximately 1 in several trillion. They had their killer. Santos sat in her car in the lab parking lot for 10 minutes, hands shaking on the steering wheel, 26 years of investigation compressed into this single moment of certainty. She thought about Timothy Caldwell frozen at 19 forever, about his parents who'd waited so long for this answer, about Detective Breslin who'd carried this case into retirement, about all the hours and dead ends and frustrations that had led here. Then she called her supervisor and said 4 words that she'd been waiting years to say: "We have a match." The next 2 weeks were a careful choreography of building an airtight case before Hendricks could be alerted. Santos worked closely with Assistant State's Attorney David Morrison, assembling every piece of evidence into a prosecutable package. They had the DNA match, which was overwhelming, but they needed to document everything else. The genetic genealogy process, the surveillance, the chain of custody, the original 1998 investigation showing Hendricks had known Timothy and worked with him. They prepared for every possible defense argument, anticipated challenges to the science, made sure their case could withstand the scrutiny that a high-profile cold case arrest would inevitably bring. Santos reached out to Detective Breslin, now 73 and in declining health, told him they'd identified Timothy's killer through DNA. Breslin's voice broke on the phone, decades of frustration and determination finally vindicated, and he said he wanted to be there for the arrest, wanted to see this through to the end. The arrest warrant was signed by Superior Court Judge Patricia Chen on August 5th. Santos assembled her team the night before the arrest, 6 officers plus herself and Breslin, who'd insisted on coming despite Santos's concerns about his health. They briefed on the target's background, his address, his family situation, the fact that he had no history of violence beyond this crime and likely wouldn't resist. But they'd take no chances because he was a murderer, regardless of how respectable he appeared. The plan was to execute the warrant at dawn, minimize the chance of media presence or Hendricks having time to prepare, get him into custody quickly and cleanly. At 5:30 a.m. on August 6, 2024, the convoy of unmarked vehicles rolled through the quiet streets of Fairfield toward Michael Hendricks's colonial home. Santos felt the familiar pre-arrest tension, adrenaline sharpening every sense, her hand checking her weapon even though she didn't expect to need it. They parked on the street, approached the house as dawn was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky, birds starting to sing in the old trees that lined the neighborhood. Santos knocked firmly on the front door, 3 solid raps that echoed in the morning quiet. Lights came on inside. A dog barked. Footsteps approached. The door opened to reveal Michael Hendricks in gym shorts and a faded Yankees t-shirt, his graying hair messy from sleep. Confusion on his face that shifted to something else when he saw the badges and the number of officers on his porch. Santos identified herself and informed Hendricks he was under arrest for the murder of Timothy James Caldwell. She watched his face carefully, trained to read micro-expressions and involuntary reactions. For maybe 3 seconds there was blank incomprehension, his brain seemingly unable to process the name or the charge or the reality of police at his door. Then something flickered behind his eyes, recognition maybe, or calculation, or the dawning understanding that his past had finally caught up with him. He didn't ask what evidence they had, didn't protest his innocence, didn't demand to speak to a lawyer. He simply stood there as Santos turned him around and placed handcuffs on his wrists, reading him his Miranda rights in a voice that stayed steady through sheer force of will. Behind Hendricks, his wife Jennifer appeared at the top of the stairs in a bathrobe, her face confused and frightened. "Michael, what's happening? What's going on?" Her voice was high and thin, the sound of someone's world beginning to crack. Santos gave her a brief explanation, told her that her husband was being arrested for a 1998 murder, that she should contact an attorney. Jennifer's face went through rapid changes, shock to disbelief to something that might have been the first hint of acceptance, because maybe on some level she'd always known something was wrong, some instinct that wives have that tells them their husbands are keeping secrets. Or maybe she genuinely had no idea, had spent 24 years loving a man who'd killed someone and hidden it perfectly. Santos didn't know which was worse. They led Hendricks to a patrol car, and Santos saw curtains moving in neighboring houses, early risers witnessing the arrest, the beginning of shock waves that would spread through this community within hours. Breslin stood near one of the vehicles, tears streaming down his weathered face, watching the man who'd murdered Timothy Caldwell finally being held accountable. Santos caught his eye and nodded, no words necessary between them, just the shared understanding of a job that had taken 26 years but was finally done. The news broke by noon, local stations interrupting regular programming with breaking news alerts. Financial advisor and former school board member arrested in 1998 cold case murder. The story had everything media loved, a decades-old mystery solved through cutting-edge science, a seemingly upstanding citizen revealed as a killer, the dramatic arc of justice delayed but not denied. By evening it had gone national, CNN and MSNBC running segments, True crime Twitter exploding with theories and outrage, Reddit threads dissecting every detail of the case and Hendrix's background. But Santos ignored the media circus, focused instead on the phone call she needed to make. She called Susan Caldwell first, catching her at home in the house on Olmsted Hill Road that had been a shrine to grief for 26 years. Susan answered on the second ring, her voice wary because detective calls had never brought good news before. Santos spoke carefully, said they'd made an arrest in Timothy's case, that the suspect was in custody, that DNA evidence had definitively linked him to the crime. There was a long silence on the other end, and when Susan finally spoke, her voice was shaking. "Who?" she asked. "Who killed my son?" Santos told her Michael Hendrix's name, explained that he'd worked with Timothy at Blockbuster, had been interviewed in the original investigation but cleared at the time. Susan was quiet, processing, and then she said something that made Santos's chest tight. "I remember him. He came to Timothy's funeral. He shook my hand and told me how sorry he was." Her voice broke on the last word. The horror of that memory recontextualized. The image of her son's killer standing in a church offering condolences while her family fell apart. Santos let her cry, offered what comfort she could over the phone, promised that they had solid evidence, that Hendrix would be prosecuted fully, that justice was finally coming, even if it had taken far too long. Emily Caldwell Chen took the news differently, her response immediate fury. 26 years, she said, her voice tight with rage. This piece of shit has been free for 26 years. He got to have a life, got to have a family, got to watch his kids grow up while my brother has been in the ground since he was 19. Why did it take so long? Santos understood the anger, had expected it, knew it came from decades of helpless frustration and grief that had nowhere to go. She explained about technological limitations, about how genetic genealogy was relatively recent, about how the investigation had never actually stopped, even when it seemed like nothing was happening. Emily's anger eventually shifted to something more complex, relief mixed with exhaustion, mixed with the awareness that no arrest could give back what had been taken. She thanked Santos, her voice breaking, said she needed to call her mother, asked when there would be a trial. Michael Hendrix was arraigned the following morning in Norwalk Superior Court, appearing in an orange jumpsuit and shackles, no longer the respected financial advisor, but just another defendant facing murder charges. The courtroom was packed with media and community members and people who'd known Timothy or the Caldwell family. The charges were read, murder in the first degree, and Hendrix entered a plea of not guilty on advice of his public defender, a competent but overwhelmed attorney named Robert Walsh, who'd drawn the assignment and looked like he wished he hadn't. Bail was denied given the severity of the charge and the decades Hendrix had already lived freely after committing the crime. He was remanded to Bridgeport Correctional Center to await trial, led away in shackles while his wife sat in the back of the courtroom crying, their adult daughters on either side of her, all three trying to process the destruction of everything they'd thought they knew about their family. The legal process ground forward to the fall of 2024. Walsh filed motions challenging the admissibility of genetic genealogy evidence, arguing it was scientifically questionable and violated privacy rights. But State's Attorney Morrison came prepared with case law from multiple jurisdictions where the technique had been upheld. Expert witnesses testified about the reliability of the science, the accuracy of the DNA match, the proper procedures that had been followed. Judge Chen ruled the evidence admissible, and with that ruling, Walsh's defense options narrowed dramatically. He couldn't argue Hendrix hadn't been at the crime scene because the DNA proved otherwise. He couldn't claim contamination because the evidence had been properly preserved for 26 years and the chain of custody was documented. His only possible strategy was arguing reasonable doubt about intent or trying to negotiate a plea deal that might spare his client a trial he'd almost certainly lose. In late October, facing overwhelming evidence and the likelihood of conviction, Walsh approached Morrison about a plea agreement. The negotiations were tense and brief. Hendrix was willing to plead guilty to murder in the second degree, in exchange for a sentence of 40 years to life with possibility of parole. Morrison refused flatly, said the Caldwell family deserved better than a deal that might someday see their son's killer released. He countered with murder in the second degree and 50 years to life without possibility of parole, meaning Hendrix would die in prison. Walsh tried to negotiate down, but Morrison wouldn't budge. and neither would the Caldwell family when consulted. They wanted certainty, wanted to know that Michael Hendricks would never be free again, would never sit in a grandchild's birthday party or attend a daughter's wedding or experience any of the moments Timothy had been denied. On November 20th, 2024, Michael Hendricks accepted the plea. He would plead guilty to murder in the second degree in exchange for life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The plea hearing was scheduled for December 3rd, and the Caldwell family flew to Connecticut to be present, needing to bear witness, needing to look Hendricks in the eye and let him see what he destroyed. The courtroom was full when Judge Chen called the case. Media and community members and people who'd loved Timothy all wanting to be there for this moment of accountability. Hendricks was led in looking diminished somehow, smaller than he'd seemed in the photos of him coaching soccer or serving on the school board, as if guilt had physically compressed him. Judge Chen asked if he understood the charges and the consequences of his plea. Hendricks said yes in a voice barely audible. She asked how he pleaded to the charge of murdering Timothy James Caldwell on or about October 23, 1998. Guilty, he said, and the words seemed to echo in the courtroom silence. Susan Caldwell closed her eyes. Richard squeezed her hand. Emily stared at Hendricks with an expression somewhere between hatred and exhausted relief. Morrison read a victim impact statement prepared by the family, and it was devastating in its honesty. They talked about Timothy, about who he'd been and who he might have become, about the computer science degree he never finished, and the tech companies he never founded, and the family he never had. They talked about 26 years of holidays that felt empty, of birthdays celebrated for someone who stayed 19 forever, of grandchildren who would never know their uncle except through stories. They talked about the man sitting before them, about how he'd hidden behind respectability while they suffered, about how he'd hugged his own children while theirs was in the ground, about the particular cruelty of attending Timothy's funeral and offering condolences while knowing exactly what had happened. Emily's voice broke multiple times reading it, and Richard had to pause to compose himself, but they got through it because they owed Timothy the truth spoken in the open. Judge Chen then addressed Hendricks directly, her voice hard with controlled anger. She spoke about the violation of trust inherent in killing someone you worked with, someone who'd considered you at least a friendly acquaintance. She spoke about the 26 years he'd stolen from the Caldwell family by remaining silent and free. She spoke about the facade he'd maintained, the respect he'd cultivated in his community, while carrying the knowledge of what he'd done. Then she formally sentenced him to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, and Michael Hendricks was led away to spend the rest of his life behind bars. And Santos felt something release in her chest that had been tight since she'd first read Timothy's case file. After the hearing, Santos met privately with the Caldwell family in a conference room. Richard looked older than his 76 years, but also somehow lighter, as if a weight had finally been lifted. Susan thanked Santos, thanked Breslin, who'd also attended, thanked everyone who'd worked the case across nearly 3 decades. But Santos could see the complicated emotions on their faces, relief mixed with exhaustion, mixed with the awareness that justice, while critically important, didn't undo the past. It didn't bring Timothy back. It didn't restore the 26 years they'd spent not knowing. It didn't heal the trauma or erase the nightmares or make the holidays feel whole. It was simply accountability, the minimum requirement of a civilized society, and even that had taken more than a quarter century to achieve. In the months that followed, life found new rhythms. Emily continued teaching, finding meaning in educating the generation Timothy never got to be part of. Richard's health stabilized somewhat, the stress of not knowing finally released. Susan established a scholarship fund at UConn for computer science students, ensuring Timothy's passion would continue through others. And Detective Maria Santos moved on to other cases, other families waiting for answers. But she kept Timothy's photo on her desk as a reminder that time doesn't erase truth, that DNA waits patiently, and that some promises take decades to keep but are worth every moment. Where are you watching from today? Have you ever known someone who seemed perfectly normal but was hiding something dark? Leave a comment below and let us know. If you want to see more cold cases solved through perseverance in science, hit that subscribe button. Because Timothy Caldwell's story proves that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied. And sometimes the truth has to wait 26 years, but it never stops being the truth. Never stop. Demanding to be heard, never stops insisting that accountability matters even when the world has moved on.